Hello and welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Forensic Psychology. And today we're really pleased to welcome Rosalind Barnett. So she's going to talk to us today about Sexbots and what that entails and how they're developing and how that relates to forensic psychology. So you're really welcome and really nice to speak to you and meet you. So I wonder if you could tell us a bit about how you got into forensic psychology.
Yeah, I mean, I've been asked that quite a few times and I can never really work out how it happened. My parents are particularly confused, but I just went to do psychology at undergrad and very on the hoof just took on the forensic module and just really enjoyed it. And it was the one that I enjoyed most of all of the modules we did. And then, yeah, I just looked into masters after that, and I happened to be doing my undergraduate at Nottingham anyway, who are one of the only places that do the doctorate. So it just kind of worked out really well. Yeah, I just have a real interest in it because of the kind of implications that it can have for so many people. And that's why I went forensic rather than kind of the clinical route, because I was interested in kind of how it could affect victims and perpetrators and who are often victims anyway, and then how it can have a wider impact on society as well. So it just, like, the implications for me were just really interesting.
Yeah. It's really interesting. And what made you then get into your research into this area in particular?
Again, I'm lost how this happened, but I just remember having a conversation with my friend on the masters about sex robots. That would have been in about 2017, and I think that the media had started to pick up on these. I don't know if you've ever been on the Sun website, but they love Sexbots. They are obsessed. So I think, yeah, it was just a random conversation after we'd seen something online, and it seemed like a bit of a silly idea at the time, so I didn't suggest it for my master's research or anything. But when I took a year in between my master's and doctorate, I just thought about how it was actually really important, and it stopped seeming so silly. So I then suggested it for my doctorate, and here we are. But yeah, I think it was kind of the media influence, and they were just becoming more of a thing, because before that it seemed it was mostly about dolls before that, but the artificial intelligence has improved so much now. So yeah, it felt really important.
Can you tell us all about Sexbots then?
So they are, well, they're basically a sex doll, but they have the added features of artificial intelligence, and they can move. Some of them can even tell jokes and things now. They've got quite advanced. But yeah, they're pretty self-explanatory. They are a doll that can basically have sex, and they look quite human-like now. So there's one in particular called Harmony. She is from a company called Real Doll, and they seem to have got the most advanced sex robot. So yeah, she kind of looks like a big Barbie, and you can do all sorts of personalization to them. So they have a website, this company, and you can change things like their eye color, their breast size, their general size, their hair color, everything. So I'll let your imagination run away with you there. So yeah, so they have artificial intelligence, so they can mimic a personality. It's still growing what that actually means and what a personality looks like, but it's improving all the time. And some of them can kind of adapt to who they're speaking to and can learn things about the person that owns them, learn kind of what that person likes and dislikes and that kind of thing. So one day I think that they will be able to completely personalize themselves to whoever owns them.
When you tell people that you work your research interest is sex bots, what's the most common, you said people laugh, but what is the most common question or response that you get from people?
Where can I get one asking for a friend? So I guess the general vibe that I get from people is a bit of worry about them. I think people seem very unsure about what that will look like, and I think part of that comes from the kind of the TV programs and the films that have come out around this idea. So if you think of all the Black Mirror stuff, which is part of how I got into this as well, actually, because I love Black Mirror. It's scary to people. And the other ones I can think of are Humans. You remember that Channel 4 show, and films like Her. I don't know if you know that one it's really good, the Scarlett Johansson one. And all of those kind of imply that something scary is going to happen. So I think firstly, people are a bit scared about what that will mean for the world. And secondly, people think it's a bit creepy.
Somehow they're going to develop their own intelligence and take over. That seems to be the theme with everything, whenever you see any of that sort of genre, isn't it? That they're going to become better than us and just take over everything. And that's
exactly, which
with humans, they tended to run away, didn't they? Gang together and run away and try to, and develop their own.
Why I really like Black Mirror, because I think that they stick to what could actually happen, and the really scary things that could happen are people could become addicted to these things and they could completely isolate them from the rest of society. Whereas films like Her are really, really good, but then they just get a bit ridiculous when these things get like souls and they want to run away and kill all the humans. So I think people understand that that's very unlikely that these robots are going to take over the world, but I think that there are far scarier things that can happen in the forensic world related to the way people will interact with real humans after they've used a sex robot.
Oh, that's interesting. Can you give an example?
It's just come to my mind actually that I should mention the campaign against sex robots. I don't know if you've heard of this.
No.
So it's led by Professor Kathleen Richardson, and she's based at De Montfort University, and she started this campaign based on the original campaign, which I think was called the Campaign Against Killer Robots, from quite a few years ago, which was all around drones being introduced and the world changing because of these kind of technology advances. So she set up this one to say that they're just going to create a horrific society where women and children are objectified, and people will, use and abuse these robots and will then go on to use and abuse real people, which we've kind of stumbled onto my research and the whole reason that I'm looking into it, because there is just a real concern that people will start to abuse people, because we've got human-like sex toy, so they're going to be objectified. They're going to objectify this toy that looks like a real human. So the worry is that it will kind of like embed this view of people as just things, objects to be abused. I used a lot of research from like child exploitation material and kind of violent pornography when I was researching my original project, because there's not much on robots or dolls. But the problem is that the research into that is so mixed, and lots of research says that it's quite helpful for people who have violent or they have sexual fantasies about children, that they can use child exploitation material or violent pornography as a way of kind of getting that out, so in like a catalytic kind of way. But then the other argument, and lots of research also shows that people get bored and they move on to the next thing. And then if you think about how realistic a a sex robot could be, it could only be worse than using pornography, because your whole body's involved in this. So you're kind of getting like muscle memory from it as well, and it might just not be enough anymore, so a person would move on to a real person.
Yeah, I guess it's the same that what we're saying about pornography, isn't it? When is it protective and actually helpful, and when does it become a problem? What about are there male sex bots? Is it just a female sex bot that you can purchase? Can you buy male ones?
Another company who makes sex robots is called True Companion, and they have one called Roxy and one called Rocky. And I forgot to say actually that Roxy's quite a problematic robot. So she's actually what inspired my research, talking about her like she's a real person. That robot has multiple personalities. So one of them is called Frigid Farah, and you can so she's programmed to just say no to sex, which is obviously problematic. And one of them is called Young Yoko, and I think the tagline for that is that she's barely 18 and waiting for you to teach her. So there are real bad implications there from that robot. So Roxy exists, and then she has a counterpart called Rocky, but it's just not popular. No one really buys him. But it's a really interesting conversation, the idea of men and women using them, because for some reason sex toys are considered more socially acceptable for women, and women buy vibrators and dildos which represent a penis, yet it's quite weird still in society for a man to buy something like a fleshlight. But it's then considered more acceptable that a man would get a sex robot or doll and a woman would not buy that. So I haven't quite figured it out in my head yet, but there's something there about men maybe wanting more of the full experience and women maybe wanting just the outcome.
Which is generally the opposite to what people think, is that men just want sex and not interested in intimacy. So it's opposite. It seems intuitively that seems the opposite to what you'd expect.
Definitely, you would think that maybe a woman would want to kind of imagine it being more of a real relationship. But yeah, that's just not what we see. And I don't know whether that's just because of how sex toys have been marketed over the years. But yeah, it's probably a combination of loads of different things over the years, but it's really interesting.
And so how has your research evolved? Because is there one country where they're more prevalent, and have you sort of seen an impact on sort of, for instance, relationships in those countries?
So I think that the country most people think of when you talk about something like this is Japan. And they do have lots and lots of sex dolls and sex robots, but from the research I've done, they don't seem to be the most advanced. The most advanced seem to be the US, because they have companies like Real Doll or True Companion, and they're really, it seems like they're putting a lot of money into this kind of artificial intelligence, and I guess a lot of it comes off of how far a country has got with normal robot development, and maybe Japan hasn't got there, I'm not sure. But yeah, so Japan and China are developing and shipping out these dolls, and they are the most well-known countries that are developing child dolls and robots as well, which is particularly concerning. But yeah, the relationship thing is very interesting, and we've seen a lot over the years of Japan or Japanese people just becoming more and more isolated, and spending all day at work and then having a couple of hours maybe when they get home. And do you remember those things that came out that were kind of like little, I can't remember what they looked like, but they kind of spoke to the person and said hello when they got home? Do you remember these at all? So I think it was a couple of years ago, but it was basically like the voice of a robot that would just talk to them and knew them and knew things about them. So it is very her-like. So it feels like it's been building up for years now, that people in countries such as Japan just don't have the time to build real relationships with people. So I think things like sex robots will just continue to become more and more popular there, because they are being used as partners as well. There's quite a few documentaries where people have gone out to places like Japan, and they've spoken to individuals who say they're married to these robots or dolls. Or I think I saw one where he was married to one, but he had a mistress, and then he had a girlfriend, and and he said that he was in love with these. So I don't know, I think it will impact on relationships very differently for different groups of people. I think it could have really positive impact on relationships for people who are perhaps very socially anxious. So it could build up a kind of resilience for speaking to people, or it could have the opposite effect and mean that somebody who's very socially anxious just doesn't need to improve that, and they'd just be happy with a sex robot instead. But yeah, I've seen examples of people having real relationships and owning robots as well. So it's very different for different people. There are even robots that have family mode. So if you turn that on, the robot won't say anything sexual, and they can be around children, they can make jokes. So people are developing these with the intention that they could be kind of part of the family.
So what is your research then? What sort of research have you been doing?
So I've been looking at, it's very attitudes based, and that is because it's very difficult to research this kind of, it would be impossible to do an RCT or anything on this at the moment. So I've been looking at whether there's a relationship between attitudes towards sex robots and sex dolls, and kind of belief, rape myth acceptance, and child sexual abuse myth acceptance. And then I've also looked at a load of kind of other personality things like moral disengagement, the Dark Tetrad, and then demographics. So I've just been looking to see whether there are relationships with kind of general acceptance of them, acceptance of child robots, and whether people think that they should be legal, and then also previous use or future use of them. So that was one of my projects. And then my second project, I looked at, I used linguistic inquiry word count software, so Luke, to look at kind of word patterns. And I looked at whether we were seeing particular kind of positive or negative words, or risk-focused words, or reward-focused words for people when they're talking about things like child sex robots. Or I also, for that one, went into virtual reality pornography and holograms, which will probably one day be used in pornography. And I also looked at the use of child sexual abuse and violent sex in video and computer games. So just a general focus on loads of weird things are going to happen to technology, and we're not keeping up with it, basically. Holograms is crazy to me, but I think it's going to happen.
Is literally when it comes, this is a really silly question maybe, but it's literally when it appears in front of you as something real, but it's just a vision.
Yeah, and I've tried to explain this to people before, and people don't really believe me, but there is research from, I can't remember which university it is, but they've reported that they've managed to create a robot that, a hologram that you can touch. And if they can do that, then what's to stop them eventually being able to make a hologram that someone could have sex with? And people are talking about this on kind of blogs about pornography, and saying that this is likely to kind of eclipse the popularity of normal pornography, because why wouldn't it? Like, holograms are probably the end goal, because they're better than sex robots, normal pornography, VR, because you would be able to change this hologram whenever you wanted, change the way it looked. You'd be able to touch it, you'd be able to hear it. So it's kind of the end goal of creating a virtual sexual experience.
But how is that different to a sex bot then, which you can feel presumably?
Well, the difference is that you'd be able to change things about it, whereas a sex robot, it looks like what it looks like. So the idea is that a hologram, you could change it based on whatever fantasy you're having that day.
What have your findings been?
So I didn't find much, but I did find consistent relationship with pornography, which is quite unsurprising, that if people use pornography more frequently, they're far more likely to want to use a sex robot in the future, or to use any of the other advanced sexual technology. But they were also more likely to agree with things like child sex robots should be legal, which is a bit worrying. And then the other main finding I had was a relationship with acceptance of sexual aggression myths. So people who had used sex robots in the past or wanted to in the future were more likely to agree or to believe sexual aggression myths, which suggests to me that there might be slightly more concerning motivations for their use. And I would be concerned that if you combine those kind of myths with use of something that isn't a sexual object, then is that going to develop into problematic sexual behaviour in the community? So those are my main findings, and it was very similar kind of findings in the second project of just the language use backing that up. So kind of there was some links between kind of myth acceptance and using more positive words when discussing violence or child sexual abuse.
And how did you conduct the research? Who were your participants? Were you able to access people who actually bought the dolls or used them or thought about buying them?
Yeah, so when I originally planned the research, I really wanted to interview people who had used them, and then it was just not going to happen because it's so hard to find that individual group of people. So I went for a community sample in the end. So it was lots of online recruitment, and I hit the jackpot with Reddit actually. So I advertised it there and went on subreddits for people who use dolls and robots, or just generally have an interest in kind of technological advances, and yeah, ended up getting over 700 people responding, but it was only out of that, I think I only had about 30 people who used them before, but that was enough to actually look at whether there were links between previous use. So it would be interesting in the future to get a bigger group of people. And there was a piece of research that came out last year by Craig Harper and Rebecca Livesley, and they looked at doll use, no mention of robots, and they recruited specifically people who used them. So their research is worth a read, and they found that people who used them had higher endorsement of kind of sexual aggression beliefs, but less proclivity, so less behavioural proclivity. So they were suggesting that actually doll use is cathartic because these people are likely to hold those beliefs or views or fantasies, but are less likely to act upon it. So I kind of have used their research in mine as well. But yeah, that's basically the only research that exists at the moment.
It's a small but fantastic pool of research already out there. So like, where do you hope that it will go in the future? Like, what are your hopes and aspirations for the field?
So I do hope that there are bigger studies of people who actually use them. I think robots is it's quite far in the future, mainly because they're so expensive. So sex robots are about $10,000 at the moment, depending on how many changes you make to it. So it would be really difficult to find people who have enough money to buy one of those and then who are willing to take part in research. So I think dolls is quite realistic, that you'd be able to find a big pool of people. And yeah, I just think it's really hard to predict how you could actually do this research with it still being ethical. So I kind of want it to go further than just measuring beliefs, but how can we do that without putting real people in danger? And how can we do that without knowing that people have actually been offended against because of it? So it might be that in a few decades' time, we know that people have offended after using them. But at the moment, we just don't know that, and we can't predict that, so we can't measure it. So it might be worth using kind of more behavioral measures, or maybe even cognitive measures, and looking at kind of, I don't know really where their eyes go.
Eye tracking and things like that.
Yeah, so that might give us a bit more of a kind of an empirical basis for the research, but at the moment it feels a bit far in the future ethically. And I also know that group, the group of people who are likely to use dolls or robots, do not enjoy the suggestion that they might be dangerous. So it would also be quite difficult to recruit people for that reason, because you are going to have a group of people who would use them but would never even think of offending, and they're going to be tarnished with the same brush when we come in and say, oh, there's a chance that you might be more violent or something.
But I guess that's no different to the pornography use, or even people you use as sort of a contrast group in the community about any sort of this sort of area of this research, really. You're suggesting the same could be said, that they're somehow being accused of something they're not doing. But
definitely.
It's so new, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there's maybe a bit of defensiveness at the moment because it's so new, and because it's quite a small group of people who want to use them. So there's an element of, why are you accusing me of being dangerous for doing this, when kind of the link with pornography goes back further, so it's just kind of more cemented, I would think.
Do you know if there's any more research being done in China or Japan where their use is more ahead of ours, or the US?
Not that I know of. I haven't seen any research coming out. I think people are aware of it, but the whole evidence, well, there's not really an evidence base about robots. Everything is very philosophical. There's a book called Robot Sex, straight to the point, which is full of articles about it, kind of scientific articles, but they're very philosophical about these could be the potential problems with it. And the other research is kind of calls for empirical research. There's two studies that were kind of public attitudes they were 2016, 2017. But that's kind of all that's out there. So I definitely don't know of anywhere in Asia looking at it. I would think that the US, there might be some researchers out there interested in it, but it's still just a very new field.
Is this something you're going to do moving forward, or is it something you're interested in for your research, but then you're going back to the day job?
Well, yeah, I don't know. So I work in practice, and then I work, as I was saying to you at the start, I work as a lecturer. So there's and that's a teaching job. There's no time for research or anything. I would be interested in it if somebody was interested in doing it with me, someone who's very good at stats, because it doesn't feel like anyone else is really doing it apart from Craig Harper with the dolls. And I think it is really important. so I would be interested in doing it. I just don't know what that would look like yet, because I don't think I'd be interested in a research job. So maybe it would just be something on the side. But I don't know, looking into the other advanced sexual technology as well was really interesting. And I think that more could be done in relation to kind of VR pornography as well. I saw an article earlier actually that was about a woman who went into a VR game and she was gang raped in the game. I don't know if you saw this. And because it's VR, she kind of felt like it was actually happening to her. So has reported it, and there are other examples of that as well. I think there was a blog put up a few years ago, not in VR, in just a computer game where somebody was raped. And I find that a really interesting and important area of research as well, that no one would ever think of that's happening, that people are being virtually assaulted. So yeah, so I think I'll keep a foot in the door with this kind of research, but not sure what it'll look like job wise.
But that is very disturbing, but it's not unusual in sort of even mainstream films where these sorts of scenes happen and people take it as part of the film and don't object to the fact that people are being gang raped or sexually assaulted, or sexual violence is somehow used to titillate in films, and people don't think anything of it really. So I guess it's not a step further that you would be in that position. So, but so in the VR, is it your sort of avatar that's in that position then, so you would feel like it was you? Is that, or are you watching it happen to someone else?
So in VR you'll have the kind of headset on, and I think some of them even kind of have touch stuff now, and I don't know if you saw, sorry to bang on about Black Mirror, but there was a Black Mirror, it had, I think it was vipers or snakes or something, and it was about virtual reality and games, and kind of two friends ended up having a sexual relationship in VR, and then it all became, are we attracted to each other outside of this, or is it because of VR? And that had all sorts of things like it actually felt like they were having sex in the game, and that doesn't feel too far off in real world. I think that they could quite easily invent ones that you can feel what's happening to you, and we already have things like teledildonic devices where people can control sex toys from across the world. So it's going to happen, and if we have really realistic VR where people can feel everything, they can see it, they can hear, then kind of who are we to say that that's any different to being assaulted in the real world? So yeah, I think it's a really concerning advance. Technology is not always good, these advances.
It's another avenue for criminal offences and everything, isn't it?
Yeah, and we're not very good at keeping up to date legally with things like this. So for example, in the UK, the law about child robots and dolls is not very good. We've just used the Obscene Articles kind of Act, which means that it's illegal to import child dolls, but there's nothing saying that you can own one. So if we haven't caught up with that, which has actually been probably going on for quite a few years, then it feels like it's going to take us a long time to catch up with things like VR or even holograms.
So would that mean if somebody made one in this country, it wouldn't be illegal? It's only illegal to import it?
Yes, for some reason. And there's talk of, or there's been reports of people even just making them on 3D printers and that kind of thing. So it's not difficult to create something like a child doll. A child robot would be another story, but there's nothing to say that somebody wouldn't develop one of those here.
So what would you like to do then in your future as a forensic psychologist? What do you hope to do?
Well, I do really enjoy working in practice. So I work on a specialist LD and ASD ward at the moment, which incidentally is another part of this whole thing, because there are suggestions that people with autism or LD might be able to use things like sex robots, and it'd be really helpful for them. And I don't know if you've heard of the kind of sexual rights dilemma. Says, who are we to stop people from having sex if they can have sex with something like a robot, because people kind of consider it a sexual a human right even. So yeah, so I'm presenting about this next week actually to some of my colleagues in LD and ASD world, because they're really fascinated about whether it could be used with this group, and also what kind of happens if somebody is discharged and requests something like this. Do we have any legal framework to say, no, you can't have one? And we probably don't, unless they have a particular history. So yeah, so I'm interested in working in practice, and I do have a particular interest in working with people who've committed sexual offences. And I think that encompasses all sorts of things, but it's interesting to see how things technology-wise just feed into practice. And so I don't think that will go away, even if I stop looking at into this kind of research.
Interesting, but I guess it's a position where you could apply for a grant to do a piece of research in that sort of area as it develops. But it does sort of raise moral arguments that we often aren't in the position to, or think we should be making these sort of decisions. I remember seeing a programme about a place which was sort of a respite home for people who were adults who were terminally ill. And this young man was 19, 20 years old, and he wanted to experience having sex. And so he wanted to have employ the services of a sex worker. So because this, they were saying, the people in the home were saying, we don't want to stop you having that, but it's illegal. So they couldn't be seen to be sort of condoning somebody breaking the law within their home. And the parents were saying, well, we're not really sure we want it in our home either, and would he want to be in that position in his own home? So it was really, for me, raised a lot of moral dilemmas about, you know, who makes these decisions for people, but it, as you say, a basic human right that people want to have those experiences. And so so whether this is a viable option, I mean, who are we to say, really?
Well, yeah, in that case, you might have been able to say, well, he could have access to a sex robot or doll. And interestingly, when you bring up sex workers, they do already have brothels that have sex robots in them. I think the first one was opened in Berlin. And that brings up a whole other thing about whether we should be kind of putting sex workers out of work, because a lot of them complained that this was their livelihood and it was being taken away from them. But yeah, then that raises, is it still illegal then to go to a brothel if it's not a real person in there? But lots of people say that it's a very helpful thing to do because it reduces things like disease. So yeah, there's so many moral questions surrounding their use.
Well, it's been really nice to meet you, and if people have got questions, hopefully they'll post the questions and we can post them to you, and any ideas of research and things that you might be able to be involved with. Just for me to say, let's talk forensic psychology.